Hi, everyone. Welcome. My name is Guila Benchimol, and I'm the Senior Advisor on Research and Learning at the SRE Network. I'm just going to give it, it's 3:01. I'm going to give it one more minute for people to come in, and then we're going to get started on the webinar. As you all see, it's being recorded, so just to be aware of that. And we're going to be using the chat for you to all interact with me in terms of, I'm going to be stopping along the way to ask some questions. But also, if you have questions for me, if you can put them in the chat, and Ilana Ween, our Executive Director, who's here with us, will be directing me to the questions at the end of the session. So you can either direct them to her directly, or you can just put them in the chat and she will send them over to me for the end. Okay, so I'm going to just share my screen and we will get started. But I do just want to thank everybody for taking the time today to be with us. All right. Okay, so thank you very much for coming to this session. I'm really excited to be with you today to learn together on how to respond to disclosures of sexual abuse and harassment. Just so that we're all aware, obviously we're going to be talking about sexual victimization, and it's possible that some of us have experienced sexual victimization, have disclosed or not disclosed those experiences, or have loved ones that have gone through these kinds of experiences. So I want to create a safe space for us here to acknowledge that it's a difficult conversation, but it's a necessary conversation. And I'm going to hold our experiences and experiences that I'm sharing with you in the highest regard, with a lot of care and a lot of love and a lot of kindness. A few housekeeping issues that I want to mention. So at the end of the session, sometime later this week, a recording of the session will be going out to all the participants, as well as a one-page resource sheet that will give you some tips on how to respond to disclosures in the moment. So you can keep those tips with you. You can give them out to your colleagues that we created for SRE. As I mentioned before, if you have any questions, put them in the chat. And please use the chat to interact with me as I ask you some questions. If you're a visual learner, I hope you enjoy the slides. And if you're not a visual learner and you find that to be a distraction, ignore the slides completely and just listen to my voice. So I try to appeal to all different kinds of learners here today. The last housekeeping thing I want to mention is I've recently been told by a young rabbi that I speak about sexual victimization in the Jewish community in a very different way than most people. And I asked him what he meant by that. And he said that I tell stories that most people don't talk about. That when we talk about sexual victimization in the Jewish community, it's usually, the gray, more in the harassment type of bucket. And that I often talk about things that go beyond that along the continuum of sexual victimization. And I was reflecting back to him, well, the reason is because I and others hold those kinds of stories. And so if you experience that in the conversation today, it's because I'm sharing with you some of the things that have been told to me with permission that I have to share them. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the evolution of this talk and how it came to be. In 2015, there was a series of articles where the names of rabbis and Jewish leaders were splashed across Jewish media and non-Jewish media as well for instances of sexual victimization that they had caused. And a group of rabbinical students approached me in 2015 and they said, can you please come and train us, because we never want our name to be in the media around sexual abuse or sexual victimization, or even like any kind of impropriety, the perception of impropriety. And so I developed this checklist for them on how to respond to disclosures of abuse, specifically for rabbis, which I have amended for today's session, and we will go through it at the end. But over the years, I have revisited that checklist and I have added to it based on my work with survivors, based on my work in and outside of the Jewish community, and based on the research that I have done. And also, I have, in preparing for this session, I decided that it wasn't enough to just give out the checklist and to talk about the checklist, but that we needed the context for why the checklist exists. We needed the context for what happens when somebody discloses. And so this session is really going to be from the perspective of survivors and what survivors have shared. It draws upon the SRE research report where we actually interviewed survivors and looked at what they have told other people about their experiences. And it also draws upon my doctoral study, as well as my work with survivors in the field. The takeaway from today is that just like victimization happens in community, I hope that healing also can happen in community with the way in which we respond to victimization. So a quick roadmap for what we're going to do today. This session is for anyone. It's for anyone because anybody may receive a disclosure from a friend, from a colleague, from a family member, from a congregant, from a rabbi, anybody. It can occur in a community setting. It can occur in a casual conversation. It can occur at a family dinner. It can occur at any time. But the session is not legal advice and is not focused on legal policy or HR policy or what a CEO should do. You yourself should consider this as, she's telling me this information, but in my role as X, what special obligation might I have? There are other trainings for that, and there are resources online for you to look up. So if you work at a university campus, for example, if you work for Hillel, you can look up how to respond to disclosure on a university campus, and there are special obligations that you may have to fulfill. But this is more for the kind of disclosure that comes from one human to another at any point in anybody's life. What it doesn't cover, though, is the disclosure of a minor. So this does cover if an adult tells you about the child sexual abuse they may have experienced in the past, but it does not cover what your obligations are to a minor, because SRE's focus when it comes to the bucket of safety is generally on adult victimization. So that is what this session is and is not about. We're going to cover what are disclosures and the forms they may take. What are the things that victims and survivors think about before they will disclose? What are the barriers to and benefits of disclosing? What do we need to know about secondary victimization and understanding power in disclosures? How can we respond with empathy while we understand stigma and shame? Why do our responses to disclosures matter? Then I'm going to take a little bit of time to talk about advice from victims and survivors themselves, and I use those terms interchangeably. And then we're going to end with a how to respond checklist, which you will also receive in the follow-up for this session. So the big questions that we're going to answer today are, what do we need to understand about victimization and disclosures so that we can respond appropriately? A second question is, what is secondary victimization and how can we avoid engaging in it? Thirdly, why do our responses to disclosures of abuse or harassment matter? Does it really make a difference if I respond this way or that way, if I use this word or that word? What have victim survivors said would be helpful to them? And then what are examples of positive responses to disclosures? I've talked in the past about how we know the negative stories, but where are the bright spots? Where are the models that we can mimic, right? And so that's why I want to look at what are examples of positive responses to disclosure. So if you can just take a minute, I'm going to count to 3, but take a minute to sort of think about this question. What is your biggest fear when it comes to listening to or responding to disclosures of victimization? And on the count of 3, I'm going to ask you to put it in the chat so we can flood the chat with our initial thoughts on what our biggest fear is. What are you most afraid of when it comes to listening to or responding to disclosures of victimization that somebody else might approach you with? Okay, 1, 2, 3. Type in the chat what your biggest fears are. Making it worse, not being able to alleviate pain, responding inappropriately, not further traumatizing somebody, further victimizing, not having the power to change somebody's circumstances, which is often out of our control, putting the victim in danger. A lot of this is about saying the wrong thing, not being supportive, not handling it right, adding to the hurt, right? So this is about doing no more harm. Legal jeopardy for my organization. Thank you, Rachel, for pointing that out. That's a really important one. Not taking the right steps. Sending them to an unhelpful resource. Thank you so much. I'm not going to go through them all now, but I will go through them. But these are wonderful. So we have a lot of fears, which is actually why I was excited to prepare this session, because as I was looking at the context in which I created the checklist, I was like, right, we have to explain why this is the way to respond versus another way. So what are disclosures? Disclosures are the act of making something known and knowable. So it's not just about telling somebody, but it's about giving them the ability to know me, to know what happened to me, to know what's happening in a particular place, to know what's happening with a particular person, right? Disclosures are actually, if you go to Irving Goffman, who's a sociologist, right? If you go to 1963, this was written a long time ago. Disclosures are a way that people control the information that is known about them, specifically when it comes to a stigmatized identity. And there is no doubt that victimization in our society, sexual victimization, has been greatly stigmatized, although that stigma is waning in some ways, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But they are a strategy, they are a technique that people use to manage both their stigma, right? Do I want this person to know this about me? And the relationship. Am I close enough to this person? Do they deserve to know this about me? So it has been described as a significant and fraught process of coming out, and I use those terms particularly because those are the words that victims and survivors have used with me, that it is coming out about an invisible identity, that this was something that they were secret about when it came to victimization, but then they had to sit and think about, do they want to tell somebody about it? Do they want to use particular language? And do they want to come forward to this particular person? Disclosing impacts the person who discloses. And many of the victims and survivors I've spoken about have told me about the emotional difficulties that they have gone through after they disclose. So even in the telling over and feeling that they are unburdening themselves, they have also said, but after I disclosed, I had to take some time for myself, or I went through a depression, or I went back to some of my vices that I had stopped using because it was such a difficult thing to disclose. So an understanding that a disclosure, it might feel like it's a casual conversation, even though it's heavy. For the person disclosing, it actually weighs a lot. And there are different kinds of disclosures. There are private disclosures that might happen to friends and family. There are public disclosures. Somebody might post it online so everybody can read. They may write an article about it. They may be interviewed, right, as a tool to disclose publicly. And there are partial or complete disclosures. Sometimes a person might tell somebody and then they will never speak about it again. And survivors have told me about that. They said, I came forward, but the response was so terrible that I actually never talked about it for another 20 years. And then I decided to try again because it was eating me up, right? Or they said, I was very, very public with it in my private life, but I was very private with this disclosure in my professional life. And here are some quotes that I've shared with you on the slide from people that have told me about the experience of disclosing. So in terms of linking their private and public disclosures, survivors have told me that they needed the safety and security of disclosing privately before they could ever disclose publicly. So some people only started with private disclosures and then moved on to public disclosures. Others have said, you know, I needed the strength to disclose publicly. And others have told me the opposite, that they had disclosed publicly without telling their family and friends, and then slowly made their way to their family and friends to say, you know, there is this article and I wanted to share it publicly because they've told me that it was easier to disclose to strangers than it was to disclose to those in their private life. But the key here is that the link between the private and the public disclosures are about the support and the safety and the strength that is offered from the response that they receive when they've disclosed. Now, there are many, many barriers to disclosing, and I'm not going to go through them all. This is for the visual learners. I'm not going to go through them all, but there are many, many barriers to disclosing. The first and foremost barrier, however, is the lack of disclosure to self. So victims and survivors have talked about being unable to name what happened to them, either because they didn't have the language for it, they were never taught about safety and sexuality. So if children were abused, they didn't know how to talk about it. And it took them until becoming adults to learn the language to actually call the thing that happened to them, the thing that happened to them, right? So they didn't have the words, or they didn't identify as a victim or survivor because it was just seen as bad sex or a bad relationship. So in normalizing the thing that happened to them, there was nothing to report because it was a normal experience, right? They themselves later, as in adulthood, were able to say, oh, I upheld this rape myth because as a young adult, I engaged in this behavior, and only later I was able to realize that it was actually victimization. Some survivors from religious communities or ethnic groups talked about how disclosures were more difficult for them because of the way in which their groups or their religious community viewed victimization or viewed sexuality. And so they were afraid of what would happen if they came forward in their group because of how they would be treated or how the perpetrator would be upheld versus they themselves. And then the section on Jewish survivors on the slide is taken directly from the SRE report. When we spoke to and reviewed the accounts of Jewish survivors, they talked about being unable to name non-contact sexual victimization as something that they would want to disclose about, as something that was wrong. They talked about the fears of being stigmatized in the Jewish community. They talked about the wish to protect the Jewish community and the reputation of their organization, or even the person that harmed them. They talked about not knowing where to go with historical cases. They said, I know my organization would do something if this was something that happened today, but I don't know where to go with this historical case because I don't think anything's going to happen about it. And so in understanding the fears around disclosing, we can also understand the considerations that people make before they disclose. So first they assess, is this person safe to disclose to? And they also worry about, can this person handle the disclosure? In fact, when I was doing my dissertation and I was interviewing victims and survivors and I asked them about their disclosure experiences, one man said to me, I'm about to get a little graphic, Guila, is that okay? And I said, please, this is your story to share. You can tell me as much or as little as you wish. And he said, I don't want to harm you with telling you my story, but I need you to understand the context in which it occurred, right? So they manage the emotions of the person that they are disclosing to. They also often worry how their disclosure will impact their loved ones. If my family finds out that I'm talking about this thing that happened, how will they be impacted? Oftentimes I've heard this from victims who worry about their children, right? My child is going to read this about me or is going to learn this about me. How are they going to react? How are they going to look at me? Or they worry that their family members are going to reject them, especially if the victimization occurred in a family setting. Will my family be okay with me talking about my uncle, my father, my brother, my sister, my aunt, my grandparent, right? There's a whole fraught relationship there that's happening. And the final one, people were very worried about committing career suicide or becoming delegitimized. And this is the words that they used again, becoming delegitimized in the work that they do. Will anybody hire me if they know that I was a victim? Will anybody hire me if they know that I have come forward? And not only are there considerations before disclosing, there are also considerations after disclosing. So if you are somebody that has been disclosed to, do you recognize a shift in your relationship with the person that disclosed to you? And can you ask yourself, is that shift perhaps because of the way that I responded? So sometimes people will divide their relationships into, these are the people that know my secret, and these are the people that don't know my secret, right? So they divide their relationships that way. Or my relationship with you changed because we had a lighter kind of relationship before you knew, and a more weightier kind of relationship after you knew, or you treated me in a different way before you knew and a different way after you knew. And then finally, disclosures beget disclosures. Victims and survivors find that when they tell people, other people start telling them about their disclosures, right? So this particular survivor said, the public disclosures did enable me to feel though I was part of a growing and important social movement because I started to hear, of course, from other survivors, and they thanked me and they asked me my advice. What's important to know about this is that survivors talk about this both as a benefit and a cost, right? They were happy that people felt that they could come to them, but it was also a really big burden to hold their story while they're disclosing, and then to have to receive other people's story in that disclosing. Even though there are some fears and barriers to reporting, however, when I asked survivors, was there anything you gained from disclosing? It was really enlightening to hear all of the things that they talked about that were beneficial. So they said that disclosing allowed them to accept their history with sexual violence, that they were actually able to name it and to come to terms to it. They were able to find community amongst other survivors. The biggest surprise, though, was their embrace after being disclosed. So those that were embraced, those that did not suffer secondary victimization, said, I wish that the message in society wasn't, you're going to be shunned if you come forward. If I only knew that I would have been embraced, I could have been closer to my friends, my family, my colleagues, whoever it was that they disclosed to that received them well. It allowed them to release the shame and the stigma that they felt inside, right? They said, disclosure has been great for me because it stopped the self-blame. Some survivors cried to me that disclosing was the way that they were able to make up for their silence in the past, right? That they said, maybe people were harmed because I was silent in the past, but in disclosing, I was able to stand up for myself and to stand up for others. They were able to find their voice and power. And most importantly, sometimes you might be in a conversation with somebody and you might wonder, why are they telling me this, right? Why are they saying this thing to me? We're not necessarily so close that they are suddenly confiding in me with this heavy information. Survivors explained that being a survivor for some was such a big part of their identity that in disclosing, it was an efficient way of letting other people know who they are, because it was so integral to who they are. And it was also a way of integrating their survivorship into their life story. In telling my story, I get stronger, one said. I incorporate more of what my story is into my life. I become a fuller human being, and by sharing your story, it acknowledges who you are as a person, right? So sometimes it's actually a tool of not relationship building in a manipulative way, but of integrating who I am into your knowledge of who I am. But what happens when somebody discloses and they receive a negative response? So the negative response that victims and survivors receive upon disclosing is known as secondary victimization. It is when they are rejected or stigmatized after their disclosure. Some people call it a secondary wounding or a secondary trauma or injury. And anybody can be guilty of responding with secondary victimization. We see it happen amongst members of the criminal justice system, amongst clergy, amongst healthcare workers, friends, family, colleagues. And actually, when you all responded in terms of what your fears are, it was about this thing. Most of the answers were about saying the wrong thing, causing more harm, right? Adding pain, adding injury. So none of us want to be guilty of causing secondary victimization, but we first have to understand what it is. So secondary victimization shifts the responsibility to the victim. It frees the perpetrator from any blame, and it puts the onus and blame on the victim for their own victimization. And what's so harmful about that is not just that they feel rejected by the person they disclose to, but that those messages can become internalized. And survivors have said to me, I internalized the blame, which is why I never bothered to come forward, because I was telling myself that I'm the guilty party. And only in receiving a positive response from their disclosure were they able to release that blame. And people of all genders talk about the different ways in which secondary victimization happens to them. So for example, men have told me that when they have gone on to seek services, that all the services are offered for females, or that they've been told, men are the aggressors, you don't belong to this group. And so they don't have a way to seek services for themselves. Women have spoken specifically about being blamed in different ways than men are. And also women have talked about how their mothers' responses to their disclosures, so other women's responses to their disclosures, have felt extremely stigmatizing. Trans individuals have spoken to me about being unable to recognize the fact that they were victimized until they told their friends, who reflected back to them, that story that you're saying, if I would tell that to you, what would you say? And only with that mirror were they able to recognize what was happening to them. And in the SRE report, Jewish survivors, and I would say that this is actually across the board, I hear this from survivors over and over again, is that secondary victimization is often equal to or worse than the victimization itself, that they have no hope of anything more from the perpetrator. But when it comes to telling their Jewish organizations or their rabbis or their communities or their CEOs or their colleagues, that they expected something from them, which is why they gave them the gift of their disclosure. And so the failure to respond appropriately was so harmful for them. And again, looking specifically at secondary victimization in Jewish organizations and publications, the response in Jewish workplaces has been the disclosures were ignored, minimized, or laughed at. The victims were retaliated against. There was a reinforcement of an open secret and bystander phenomenon. Jewish women were asked to stay silent so that the reputation of the Jewish organization would not be tarnished. And in the media, these are quotes from articles about stories of victimization in the Jewish community, right? So for example, no way can it be compared to the good deeds he has done for the Jewish people. Again, upholding the person who did harm. I don't want him and his family to starve. Totally neglects the fact that there is a victim here who might also be suffering. Even if there were some comments, I wouldn't take it seriously because he made important decisions in some areas. So we can see how secondary victimization can be quite harmful. And so if you look quickly here, this cycle that I created based on my research is actually everything we just talked about. There's the primary victimization, which is the first act. Something happens, a person is victimized. Then they disclose. They disclose to whoever it is that they've decided to give this gift of disclosure. And labels start to be applied. And if the labels are stigmatizing labels, like, what were you wearing? You know not to go meet with that person privately. It is your fault. Everybody knows he's like that, or whatever those stigmatizing labels might be. There is an internalization of those stigmatizing labels, right? The person may start to believe those stigmatizing things, and then their status themselves, their understanding of who they are is altered. So that's the cycle of how secondary victimization happens in the act of disclosures. We're going to move on in a minute to better responses and how to understand stigma, shame, and empathy. But if we can just take a minute and put in the chat one new thing that you just learned about disclosure, something that you either weren't aware of or was heightened for you, one new thing that you just learned. I'm going to take a minute and take a drink. And if nothing is new, then this is all review, and that's okay too. Secondary victimization. Yes, that's a new concept. And when I was putting together the checklist or reviewing the checklist, I was like, oh, this is what I have to actually explain, because there's the first term, and then there's the first term, the first act of victimization, but we too can victimize somebody. The gift of disclosure. I will never forget the first time somebody said thank you in a disclosure and how meaningful that was. And in thinking about it, it was because it is a gift. Different genders and what the kind of support that they need. Victims feeling like they have to manage the emotions of those that they are disclosing to. The burden placed upon a person making a disclosure. Yes, we often think about ourselves in receiving the disclosure, but we have to stop and think, what are they going through in actually telling me and trusting me with this? I appreciate every single person who is writing in the chat. And if you're not writing in the chat, I know you're here and listening, and I thank you too. But the interaction is really meaningful to me, and to know that we are learning this together. Okay, so now we have to talk about power, which, power and silence is really the thing that I believe fuels my work. So on Shabbat, I just finished reading Tarana Burke's memoir about her life and the evolution of the Me Too movement. And she says something there which is crucial and came up in my research and in my conversations with survivors, which is sexual violence doesn't discriminate, but the response to it does. In some ways, it is the great equalizer. No demographic or group is exempt, but the reactions to different people telling their stories are far from equal. And she goes on to talk about how #MeToo did a lot for white victims and survivors, but not for Black women. And I have heard this time and time again from many, many people. Religious victims have told me that they have been left out of the Me Too conversation. Male victims have told me that they have been left out of the Me Too conversation. LGBTQ victims have told me. People of color have told me the same thing. Indigenous victims have said the same thing. So in thinking about power and disclosures, we have to ask ourselves this question: who can speak and be heard, included, and recognized, as well as why, when, and by whom? Whose voice do we hear? Who do we pass the microphone to? Whose stories are in the media that we consume? And if we're noticing that there are particular stories that are being told and some are missing, go out and find those stories. Find those stories and understand why they're not being told in our circles. Why are we not hearing them? Right? One of the things, and I said this when I first spoke about the SRE research report, was that the surveys about survivors weren't asking about race and ethnicity. And so then we're not going to hear about how race and ethnicity intersects with sexual violence in Jewish spaces if we're never bothering to ask that question. Because stigma happens in various ways. There's individual stigma, there's structural stigma, right? And then there's the self-stigma, and they interact with each other. So it's really, really important to understand the ways in which power impact who can speak, who can be heard, and then who can be invited to the space to act as the survivor voice. I will definitely say one of the frustrations amongst colleagues in the field that work with me in survivor spaces is who gets invited to speak after a story of victimization explodes in the Jewish media. Oftentimes it's people that don't work with survivors. Oftentimes it's people who are not survivors themselves, right? Survivors are the experts of their own experiences, and we need to value that, and we need to understand all of the different ways and things that they have to overcome in order to speak up, and we have to make space for them to be heard. And so Tarana Burke is specifically speaking about Black and Brown survivors, that's who she started the Me Too movement for. But in the Jewish community, I think we have to ask, who has the Me Too movement, SRE, this idea of safety, respect, and equity in general, right? Not just in SRE, but across the Jewish world. Who have we been talking to? Which is why I'm so grateful that Ilana asked me to do this session, because this session allows for the voices of survivors. It allows for us to stop and say, 1 second, let's stop with the organizational response and the organizational perspective and say, what is it that survivors are saying? And they are telling me, if I don't have power, I'm not going to be heard. Right? So how can we empower all victims and survivors when they speak out? What do we need to do to change the structures of our community, of our workplaces, of our listening, right? So that I can hear what needs to be said, so that I can make the appropriate changes. As I said, individual structure and self-stigma work together. Now, what do we need to do to cause destigmatization? We need to remove blame. So when you are receiving a disclosure, that's what you need to do. You need to remove blame. And I turn to Dr. Brene Brown. Many of you know her from Oprah, or from her book, Daring Greatly, and all these other places. But I found her, as a sociologist doing work on stigma and shame before, I had seen her in all of these other venues. And she talks really so beautifully about shame, empathy, and vulnerability. I encourage you to watch her TED Talks. She talks about shame being the fear of disconnection. Is there something about me that if other people know, I'm not going to be worthy of connection? That's the fear of disclosing victimization. If I tell you this thing, will you only view me as a victim? Will everything I say now suddenly be interpreted through that lens, and you're going to discount the whole Guila, right? Because you're only going to see me through a particular lens. And so she says that there are 4 qualities of empathy, which she takes from Teresa Wiseman. The 4 qualities are the ability to take perspective of another, to stay out of judgment. You're telling me the story, I am not going to judge you while you're telling me the story. To recognize the emotion in the other people and communicate that emotion back to that person. The key in empathy is to feel with the other person. It never starts with at least, right? Oh, at least this and this didn't happen to you when you were this age. At least you had a family to go to. At least you're able to tell me and get over it, right? That is never a response of empathy. The response of empathy is, you are not alone. And she says, it's better to say, I don't know what to say right now. I'm just really glad you told me. Because what makes something better is the connection with somebody else, is connecting to the other person. So our responses matter. When somebody discloses to us, our responses matter. And so I have here for you 3 ways in which they matter. First of all, our responses matter in the victim survivor's ability to recover or heal. It matters to their rate of recovery. How quickly or slowly will they heal is based on how I respond when somebody discloses to me. And also, it matters because they may choose to navigate systems, mental health systems, legal systems, survivor support systems, based on how I respond. Or they may say, this person responded so negatively to me, I'm never going to tell anybody, even a mental health professional that could help them in their healing. You do not have to be the mental health professional. Sit right now and think, what is my role? When somebody is disclosing to you, if you're a rabbi, your role is to provide spiritual care. You're not the investigator. You're not their therapist. You're just there to provide spiritual care. If you're a friend, you're there to be a friend, but how you respond will impact their ability to heal. There's also an impact on the person disclosing, and many of you wrote that that was something new for you in this session, right? The impact on the person disclosing. They talked about gaining security, strength, support, and camaraderie. Sometimes disclosures strengthen their relationships. Positive responses motivated them to continue disclosing to others. Oh, it went well with this person. I'm going to now tell this person. I'm going to now tell this person. And they were able to feel more whole. Some of them even were able to tell their story publicly. Disclosing victimization in a particular group. So Jewish survivors told me how disclosing as a Jew allowed them to speak up about abuse in Jewish communities, right? And the same for others in Muslim communities, in Mormon communities. They were able to change how abuse looks in their own religious community. Others talked about being given opportunities to lead an anti-sexual violence effort. So one survivor said to me, it's so bizarre. I was so afraid of disclosing, but because I disclosed and people heard my story and were moved by it, it brought my work internationally. I became this major public speaker, but that was never the intention of my work. But now this is what I do. I advocate on behalf of other survivors. Disclosing and the response to disclosures also impacted people's relationships. Sometimes it brought them closer to family and friends. In doing so, they learned that the people they were disclosing to, people told their mothers, and their mother said to them, it happened to me too. People told their siblings, and their siblings said to them, it happened to me too. However, sometimes it caused rift in their relationships. And people said, you know, that negative response, I either cannot be in relationship with the person I disclosed to, or I choose to be in relationship, but we have decided never again to talk about sexual violence. To me, this was so striking because in navigating the silences, victims continue to silence themselves because of the secondary victimization. So secondary victimization can lead to further silencing. And so the message here is, what can you do? Don't ignore the disclosure. Don't act like nothing happened. Free them from blame because they are not the responsible party. And don't push them to do anything they don't want to do. And you're going to see that in a message from a survivor in 1 minute. So in my doctoral study, I asked the victim and survivors I spoke to 3 particular questions, which I never really have been able to use, but I was able to use it in this session. I asked them, what advice do you have for other victims and survivors? What advice do you have for advocates? And what advice do you have for the general public? And so I chose the ones that I felt would be most meaningful for this session in terms of the advice they felt for the public. And I hope that you feel that there's something here, even one takeaway for you in your own work, in your own humanity, right? As we move through this world with other people. Tell the survivor you believe them. Be patient with their healing process. The brain heals when it's ready. This one I thought was amazing. You can have a conversation about sexual violence and not die, right? It's a scary conversation, but it needs to be had. We can have this conversation and nothing's going to happen to us. Tell them that it was no fault of their own, but it's the community that allows us to feel the shame. Look at how we blame women. There's so much we need to do around consent. Stop using religion as a cure because you can't cure someone from their trauma. The aftermath of trauma is the more traumatizing piece. And that's the part that we have the power to change. Going back to secondary victimization, we have the power to change that here. It comes back to the victim blaming thing for me. That was their message. Let the stories come out and don't shut them down, because we need more stories that look different. This speaks to the power piece that I said before. Different kinds of stories will highlight different kinds of victimization, different kinds of silences, different kinds of voice. Tell them that it takes a very long time, and sometimes a very, very long time, for someone to realize that they are a victim. So if people say, why didn't they report? Why didn't they come forward? Why didn't they tell their CEO? The most essential thing is to correct the idea that most survivors lie. I loved this one. I'm going to read the whole thing. Believe the victim, praise the victim, comfort the victim, don't question the victim. This is their words. Don't push the victim. Be grateful for what they share whenever they share it. Don't push for more. Tell them you admire them for surviving and disclosing, and anything else you can think of praising them for. Sexual violence is about having our choices stolen from us. Don't replicate that damage. So if a person tells you, I'm disclosing to you, but I don't want you to go and make choices for me that are not my choices, that is really important. Tell them that healing is possible. Don't ever give up on a survivor. Think about the fact that there are discriminatory services that are available at the moment for survivors. How can we change that for them? So those are the words of survivors directly that they asked me to share with the public in my teaching. And I hope that you gained something from this. I'm going to take the next 2 minutes to run through some do's and don'ts that are based on everything that I just spoke about now. You're going to get this particular do's and don'ts resource sometime later this week, and then we're going to take some questions from the room. Okay, so do listen to and believe the individual. Make sure that they are safe and provide them with helpful resources. Now, those resources may be mental health resources, legal resources, financial resources, but some helpful resources. And if you want more help, reach out to me at the end and I can help you with that. Do not blame the individual or imply that they were in any way responsible. Don't ask questions that further victimize them, such as asking for proof. Do thank them and acknowledge their courage. They have given you a gift by telling you their story. It seems that a lot of you were moved by that particular idea. Do not discourage them from discussing this story with others or taking next steps, and don't tell them how they should feel. So survivors have told me what really bothered them was being told, like, you really shouldn't think of the perpetrator that way, or you shouldn't be feeling this way, or even in watching the person they disclosed to get angry on their behalf scared them, right? So check your own emotions while you're holding space for the survivor. Acknowledge the bravery and courage it took for them to disclose their victimization to you. Do not minimize the pain and suffering they endured by being victimized or in remaining silent until they were ready. Understand your role. So when someone is disclosing to you, what role am I serving right now? That's the role I should be fulfilling, and fulfill your legal obligations. Find out if you have legal obligations and fulfill those things. Provide them with the care they need. Do not make promises of confidentiality that will put them at danger, and don't enable the furtherance of violence or abuse. So that doesn't mean that you should not promise confidentiality, but make sure that you can keep those promises. Respect their desire and need for privacy. They may never want to talk to you about this again, and you can ask them, right? Let me know when you want to talk about this. Follow up with them to see how they are doing. Do not attempt to launch an investigation on your own. You're not the police. And don't ignore them because you feel conflicted or uncomfortable with something that they told you. You should seek advice on how to deal with this from experts. And you should also recognize that it might be a time of crisis and take care of yourself. Do not attempt to deal with the situation on your own. Recognize the limit of your expertise and your role. And don't deny your feelings regarding what you have been told. If they told you about another friend of yours, acknowledge that you might be in a position of conflict, right? Don't deny your own feelings to yourself. This is not a final word on how to respond to disclosures. There are many, many, many sources out there, but this is based on what I have learned from and with and by survivors. So I'm going to take questions in 1 second, but I'm going to count to 3 again. And I'm going to ask us to make this stick? How do we make this learning stick? What is something you found surprising, troubling, interesting, or committable, what you can commit to from today's presentation about disclosures? And this is the way I want us to make it stick. Is there something that we can take away, or something we want to investigate more because it was surprising, or something that we want to ask because it was a little bit troubling? So how do we make it stick? 1, 2, 3, if you can post it in the chat, and then I'm going to take some questions. Saying thank you for the disclosure. Thank you, Rachel Fisher. More about the differences of survivor experiences and their needs across identities. Yes, this is definitely one where we need more work, I would say, in the Jewish community. Conversation is activism. This conversation alone is activism because it's a learning for us. More about different supports and resources for survivors. Keep filling the chat. Reaching out to mental health professionals. Yes, thank you. I'm going to stop sharing, keep filling the chat, and I'm going to turn to the questions that you've either been putting in the chat or with Ilana. Okay. You no longer see my slides, right? Recognizing the extent of secondary victimization, how this aligns with the psychology behind disclosures. All right. Okay, we're going to turn to the questions, and you can still feel free to put comments in the chat. All right, so number 1, how do we balance the victim's need to be believed and supported with, for example, our reporting process? How to balance the statement of, I believe that this happened to you and support you, with the fact that we have to go through an information gathering process after that. Okay, that's an excellent question, which always comes up in any presentation around disclosures. And so I want to just talk about post-MeToo, right? Hashtag believe survivors, believe all survivors. That was sort of the message. And advocates were being told, how are we supposed to believe everybody, right? There's processes and we have to go through steps, and how do we know? And what if people lie? Which, by the way, going back to what the advice from victims to the public was, is to defeat this idea that victims lie all of the time, right? That was one of the messages. For so long, we have started with disbelieving survivors, that this was why the message was believe survivors. That's number 1. For so long, the starting place was, how do we know? And let's investigate them. And Dr. Jennifer Fried's Darvo, right? Deny and reverse victim and offender order, right? The victim is the offender because they must be lying. So the believe survivors was sort of a starting point, right? Don't start from a place of disbelief. Start from a place of, I am taking what you're telling me at face value. But because this session was really just about human to human interaction, this wasn't about CEOs, and this wasn't about HR, and this wasn't about lawyers doing an investigation, right? This is about when somebody is telling you their story, there's no reason for you to question them and to say, do you believe them? Do you not believe them? If you are a person who is in a position that has to investigate or has to go through some reporting process, these complaints intake, I mean, first of all, Ilana, I think it's okay for me to say SRE will be offering trainings on how to investigate and how to know if you need an investigation and how to know if you need an internal versus an external investigation. We're in those conversations, and those people need to be trained. But in a conversation with a person who is telling me their story, I'm not the investigator. I don't have a complaints process. I'm Guila, the listening ear, right? And so I want to create an environment where the people in my life know that I can be an address of safety and listening to them and with them. That doesn't mean that I have to go and make comments about the person that they are talking to me about. I am responding to the person disclosing to me about their experiences. So that's what I want to say about that. There are processes and there is a balance, but that is for those people that are in charge of those processes. And so if you are one of those people, watch out for the SRE newsletter and the emails that will come your way about those trainings. And I highly recommend that you attend them. Number 2, What if hearing a victim story compromises a particular role I hold in an organization? So I'm not sure what that one means. Does whoever asked it want to put in the chat, or does somebody want to write what they think that means? How would it compromise your particular role in an organization? I mean, the way that I think about it is, if I worked somewhere and I was told something about the organization, for me personally, like, do I feel integritous continuing to work there? That's why in the checklist, I say, don't deny your feelings about what is being told to you, right? We are complex people who hold multiple identities, who wear multiple hats all of the time. So even while I am Guila Benchimol, the individual, I am also the SRE Senior Advisor, the SNAP, board member, the whatever it might be, fill in the blanks. We all hold those things. And so when somebody is telling me something, I may feel uncomfortable being in a place or being part of a place that they are talking to me about. Don't deny that. Deal with it. You might need to seek your own guidance while you are dealing with a disclosure. So in the moment, you can go back to Brene Brown's words of, thank you so much for telling me. I am not sure what to say. I am so sorry that happened to you. I'm here for you. Or, I really want to be helpful. I'm going to get back to you with helpful resources. But get back to them. That's the key. Don't leave the person hanging without some guidance and advice. What is a meaningful individual or organizational response to disclosure that affirms that experience of the survivor and supports their agency? So this is where it gets tricky. I'm going to get to the individual response first and then the organizational response, because of what I've heard from survivors about the organizational response. A meaningful response to disclosure that affirms the experience of survivor and supports their agency is, thank you so much for telling me. I am so sorry that happened to you. What can I do to be of assistance? Or, is it something that you want to talk about further? You also might have to remember, you might not have all the details. Just because somebody's telling you what they're telling you, they may still be holding back on parts of the story. So you don't have the full picture, and you might never have the full picture, and that's okay. It's their choice. But if they tell you, I don't want to do X, Y, and Z, respect that, as long as nobody is in danger. If somebody is in danger, that's a separate conversation, which I don't have the time to go into right now, right? But oftentimes, some people will say to me, how can I get this person to tell the media? They have to tell the media. They don't have to tell the media. You want them to tell the media, but telling the media is really, really fraught process, right? So it's not your job to have the survivor go and have to fix the Jewish world, right? That's not their responsibility. That's maybe your responsibility, but it's not their responsibility. So it's saying, I respect your choices. You might not have to agree with their choices, but you don't necessarily have to tell them that, right? Now, in terms of an organization ensuring that the person has agency, it's different, because the organization might have some legal obligations. And I've heard time and again from professionals that say, the organization says that they're going to take these complaints, confidentially. And then the HR leader says to me, I can't take a complaint confidentially. How am I supposed to investigate the thing, right? Also, survivors have said to me that the organization said to them, well, if you don't want us to do anything about it, we're not going to do anything about it. And the survivor said, I wanted them to do something about it. I didn't want to be the one to do anything about it, right? So you can listen to the disclosure as a CEO or as an organizational leader and still do things that doesn't compromise the safety of the person who disclosed to you. Again, if you're in that position, attend future trainings that we're going to be offering. Okay, before we close, because there are 5 more minutes, I first want us to take like a deep breath, because this is a heavy session, even for me who lives in this space, all of the time. And so I imagine for all of us attending, it is heavy. I want to give a chance, is there anything else that anybody wants to write in the chat if you weren't able to ask in the questions to Ilana? Because I'm going to go through the chat later to see everybody's comments, but I wasn't able to answer everything. I see there's a question about mandated reporting. So it's really complicated to get into. I was just reviewing the different laws of mandated reporting in different states. And so because of the complications around the laws in different states around mandated reporting, that would be another session in and of itself, but I'm happy to discuss it later. And I know, for example, where I live, and I live in Canada, so totally different country, but every single person is a mandated reporter. It doesn't matter who you are. Any adult is a mandated reporter. In some places, only particular individuals working in particular fields are mandated reporters. That's why I wrote in the checklist, know your role and your legal obligations. So if somebody discloses to you and the person they're disclosing to you about is around children, for example, and they are continue to be not safe because they are around children, you might have some legal obligations to report, but you need to find out what your obligations are, and that's really, really important. There was one last question. I want to respect everybody's time, and it's 3:56, so we do still have 4 minutes. There is a question of, one of the things I spoke about was knowing your role in the conversation. Is it appropriate to check what role the person disclosing is looking for? For example, if you are a friend and coworker, is your role friend and listening ear, or coworker and advocate? So I'm going to put my mom hat on. You know, we have older kids, and when they get older, you are limited in your ability to influence your children or have them do the things you want them to do. So I will say, do you want some advice now, or do you just want me to listen, right? So I do think that it's appropriate if you are coming from an authentic place, and the response to disclosure must be authentic. If you are coming from an authentic place and saying, like, I recognize that you're telling me this about, for example, the organization that I work in, you know that I work there. I want to be able to respond to you, you know, as your friend. But I'm also going to, you know, name that conflict. And I think naming is really important. It goes back to that, you know, you can have a difficult conversation and nothing's going to happen. I want to name that here so that we're not pretending that this isn't an issue. I think that's okay to have that kind of a conversation. And again, you can't set up the rules and the parameters for any kind of disclosure because they happen, you know, instantaneously. You don't know that they're coming unless somebody says to you, listen, can we meet for coffee? I really want to talk to you about something that happened to me, and then you can prepare yourself. But you might not be really prepared for that disclosure. And so in the moment, you could say, I want to name these, you know, difficult pieces of this, but I am here for you, and I want to respond to you. How would you like me, you know, how can I best help you? And they might say, I don't know. And you can come back later and say, if you're willing to talk about it, I've had some ideas, right? But again, make sure you're not removing the agency from the person that was disclosing to you, that has disclosed. So to remind everybody, you will be receiving the do's and don'ts of disclosures. I am more than happy to add to it or to make it a living document if you all want to send me your own thoughts about what I should add to it or maybe take away from it, or really your thoughts. I'm very open to that. You can put my email in the chat, or I'll put my email in the chat. So please, you know, I'm very happy to add to that, but you will be getting this document. It's not the final say. You will also be getting a recording from this session. And I just want to end with a blessing that we should all have the wherewithal to be good friends, to be good listeners, to be good responders, and to be worthy of the trust that is given to us with the gift of disclosures that people might come to us. I will also say that my background as a Jewish educator, when I was preparing this, I was like, oh my goodness, I don't have any Jewish text. Where's the Jewish text? I have to include that. And I went back to the teaching of Dr. Ilana Stein-Hain that said, you know, we have to first have this discussion and then go back and say, okay, what are the challenges in the text and what are the promising practices that our Jewish texts give us? So for those of you on this call that are clergy, I encourage you to layer this session with what the Jewish text would tell us about how to respond. But I think this conversation that we had is a precursor to looking at the text, because for me, it's what's been missing in the Jewish community around how to respond to disclosures. It is 4 p.m. where I am. I wish you all a good day. Do something kind and peaceful for yourself after this difficult conversation. And please know that I'm available for advice. All right. Thank you so much. Take care.